She was once a pure and beautiful nun, the kind who liked to spend her afternoons drinking sheep's blood, praying to God, and letting her soul drift free. A man's shout instantly dragged the girl out of her fantasy and back into reality. There, a man was struggling in the bushes, and this was an isolated island, cut off from the rest of the world. There were only 3 nuns on this island, forgotten by time, so how could a man suddenly appear here? The girl was terrified by what she saw and immediately ran back to the convent to tell her 2 sisters. At that moment, the 2 older nuns were cutting up lamb chops for dinner when they heard Carla say that a man had arrived on the island, dressed in a black robe and wearing a white collar. The older nun quickly realized he might be a lost priest. The 3 of them started to panic. After all, they had not seen a stranger in years. Just as they were at a loss, the man had already appeared right in front of them. For a moment, both sides stood in open hostility, but judging from the man's clothing, and from his introduction as Father Ignatius, Sister Iphigenia, the one in charge, soon lowered her guard. She introduced the 2 younger sisters behind her to him. It turned out the priest was a clergyman sent to investigate and report abandoned church property. He had been assigned to inspect this convent, a place the church had long forgotten and officially listed as abandoned. Ignatius's sudden arrival shattered the decades of peace the nuns had lived in. He represented modern civilization, male authority, and interference from the church, and all of that clashed directly with the primitive religious order the 3 nuns had clung to. But the timing could not have been worse, because the man's phone was dead, so he had no way to contact the outside world and could only stay here for the night. Very soon, this desolate little island was about to take a brutal turn. To welcome this guest from far away, the nuns even brought out a bottle of red wine that had been sealed away for years. The 3 nuns also changed into more proper robes. Dinner was prepared lavishly, though the wine had long since lost its flavor. What was even more unexpected was that, after being cut off from the world for so long, they were not used to the knives and forks kept in the drawer, and using their hands seemed much easier. The priest could only watch, making the whole scene more than a little awkward. After dinner, the nuns sat by the table knitting while chatting with the young priest. When Iphigenia asked him why exactly he had come here, everything suddenly changed. It turned out the church wanted to tear down the convent and build a new retirement home, so elderly people from the mainland could spend their later years here. That meant the 3 of them would no longer be able to live here. Once the decision was confirmed, they would have to move out immediately. As for the flock they regarded as their sisters, the priest suggested it would be best to slaughter them all. The nuns saw the sheep as saints, and had long regarded themselves as the lambs of God. Their faith was deeply unusual, so they refused to let the convent be destroyed, and they could not bear the idea of their sisters being slaughtered. The 3 of them began discussing how they might save it, but before they could reach any conclusion, the priest suddenly barged in. He said his phone was missing, and that he also needed a bed to sleep in. What he never expected was that Iphigenia would take him straight to the sheep pen and tell him he could sleep there tonight. Clearly, after hearing that the convent was going to be demolished, everyone was in a foul mood, so they were no longer polite to this guest. In truth, the 3 nuns did not see things the same way, especially young Carla. She had stolen the priest's phone. To her, it was a fascinating object from another world. She could not resist picking up the fork and knife the priest had used and smelling them close to her nose. At the same time, she cut a piece of fabric from the priest's clothing. Then she took out the wool garment she had hidden under the floor, sewed that piece of fabric onto it, and quietly savored the scent left on the priest. Because Carla was gentle and innocent, and had never been around outsiders, especially men, perhaps the scrap of cloth in her hand symbolized some unknown world beyond her reach. But the other nun, Margarita, was completely different. She knelt before her faith, asking God for forgiveness, believing that stripping them of their right to live in the convent was a sin. She even swung a holy whip against her own body. The next morning arrived. The priest was startled awake by sheep eating beside him. At the same time, the 3 nuns were praying before the statue of Mary. Still shaken, the priest noticed another statue in front of him, only this one was already wrapped in creeping vines. He wanted to step forward and tidy it up, but he used too much force and accidentally knocked off half of Jesus's head. Luckily, the nuns did not notice, and he quickly put the other half back in place, but he soon paid the price for it. After that, the priest suddenly felt thirsty and tried to pick up a pot to drink some water, only to burn himself so badly that he screamed. The nuns heard the noise and rushed over to help. Kind and simple Carla seemed to feel more sympathy for this strange man, and she reached out to check his injury, only for the priest to reject her. That left the girl deeply disappointed. Meanwhile, as Sister Iphigenia was tending the fire, she discovered a shocking sight. She saw a man bound to a cross, roaring with all his strength, and the outline of that man's face looked exactly like the priest. Sister Iphigenia instantly realized that the priest was the embodiment of the devil, someone who would contaminate their pure and sacred territory, and she sensed that an unprecedented disaster was coming, so she told Carla to fetch some herbs for burns, while hinting that she should also bring a special tea to quench the priest's thirst. Clearly, they were about to take action against this uninvited guest, and that was exactly what happened. When Carla brought the herbs and tea, the girl carefully applied medicine to his hand. Then the two older sisters began carrying out their plan and handed the priest a cup of tea. The priest noticed nothing unusual and drank it all at the two nuns' urging. Then his eyes instantly grew dizzy, foam spilled from his mouth, and he lost consciousness, sinking completely into a faint. After taking him back to a room in the convent, the three of them frantically began removing the priest's clothes. When his pants proved difficult to take off, they simply reached for the scissors. The old nun moved quickly and efficiently, all in one smooth motion. When the man's strong body was revealed in front of them, the young nun's eyes instantly lit up, because this was a sight she had never experienced before. After that, the three of them began sorting through the priest's belongings, trying to figure out what to do next. After all, once a living person disappeared, his family on the mainland would definitely take notice. So after all three agreed, they decided to keep Father Ignatius at the convent for the time being. As for what came next, they could only take it one step at a time. The next morning, the priest woke from a sweet dream. From the look of it, that dream had been anything but ordinary. Meanwhile, the three women were right beside him, forcing him to hide his embarrassment. The man seemed to have lost his memory of the previous day, and since the nuns lied, saying he had fainted after falling because of his burn, the priest did not suspect anything. At first, the nuns were actually quite good to him, offering plenty of delicious food, hoping only to preserve this convent the world had forgotten. But the priest remained stubborn, insisting that he would report this place, and asking them to return his phone and the car keys he had brought with him. Yet the nuns still acted cold and unmoved. Letting him go would be like releasing a threat back into the wild, so they could only stall for time. But their indifferent attitude began to make the priest suspicious. That very night, he even had a terrifying dream. Only then did he realize that things were nowhere near that simple. Looking at the plain water placed beside him, he instinctively wanted to take a sip, but suddenly stopped. Could this water be the real reason he had fallen asleep? Everything seemed deeply abnormal, and outside the window was a cliff dozens of meters high, making escape from there obviously impossible. Bit by bit, the man finally understood that keeping him here had been the nuns' plan all along. Sensing danger, the priest waited until the nuns were gone and began searching everywhere for the belongings he had brought. He did not find his things, but he did discover a dagger in a drawer. It seemed both sides had already guessed what the other was planning, so Sister Margarita brought in a chamber pot and prepared to guard him all night. Father Ignatius was stunned. How had he become the lamb waiting for slaughter? And this was far from the end of it. Hearing the wind rolling outside, a bold idea suddenly rose in his mind. As midnight approached, Sister Margarita gradually began to snore, clearly fast asleep, but the priest was wide awake. Ever since he stopped drinking the water they prepared, he no longer felt dizzy. Then he pulled the hidden dagger from under his pillow and pointed it in Margarita's direction. After praying to God for forgiveness for his sin, he stabbed hard into the wool blanket. Thankfully, the noise did not wake the nun. Next, after a wild round of cutting, he managed to make himself a simple woolen hide coat. After several minutes of struggling, the sleeping nun still had not been disturbed. She really was sleeping like a rock. Once Father Ignatius was ready to move, he did not forget to casually take the chamber pot with him before officially launching his escape plan. But he did not know this place at all. He nearly died right in the jaws of a sheep. Though luckily it was a ram and paid him no attention, Father Ignatius ran for his life. After passing through a messy graveyard, he finally found himself facing a dense wall of thorn bushes, but getting through them safely would be incredibly difficult. And this was where his chamber pot finally came in handy. Meanwhile, the three nuns searched around at an unhurried pace. They knew very well that for a stranger to leave this place would be harder than climbing to heaven. And so, a full-on chase was about to begin. This time, Father Ignatius was truly in trouble. Sister Margarita finally had work to do as well. Slaughtering pigs and sheep was her specialty. But as women of faith, they would not take the priest's life. They cleaned his body and wounds, then shaved off his hair as well. The old nun stayed perfectly calm, since she was the one who sheared all the wool in the convent anyway. Then she threaded the needle and stitched up the scratches on the priest's body. Finally, she shaved his head, turning the man completely into a prisoner so he would not run away again. The next morning, the three nuns prayed as usual, but Iphigenia, their leader, was still uneasy. She took out the priest's car keys and decided to go outside and deal with the vehicle. That way, his escape route would be cut off, and even if he wanted to run, he could not. But the three of them had not left the convent in a very long time. Were they really going to break their vows? In the end, the three quickly agreed and set out to find the SUV the priest had driven here. This was not an island surrounded by sea on all sides, but a cliffside peninsula on a remote coast, almost completely cut off from the outside world. That also hinted at how completely the nuns' minds and beliefs had broken away from modern civilization. The priest had driven here at first, but the final stretch could not reach the convent by car, so he had continued on foot. Soon, the three women arrived at an open stretch by the sea. Young Carla, especially, looked thrilled. She had never been this far before, and had never experienced such a different kind of natural scenery. In fact, none of the three had ever seen what a modern car looked like. Standing beside the car, Carla was filled with curiosity and fixed her hair in the mirror.
No time for vanity, Sister Carla.
On the old nun's second try, she successfully opened the car door. Margarita, however, was much more aggressive. Then they looted everything inside the car, removed the gear shift, released the handbrake, and pushed the vehicle with all their strength, until the car rolled down the slope, slipped over the cliff, and vanished completely from their sight. At the same time, thunder suddenly rumbled across the sky, and raindrops began to fall. Since everything had been taken care of, it was time to return to the convent. On the other side, the priest was also awakened by the sudden thunder. Unfortunately, he was tightly bound in chains, his lower body wrapped firmly in white cloth, and his whole body was completely out of his control. Like Jesus fixed to the cross, he suffered endless pain under the gaze of the statue of Mary beside him. Only now did Father Ignatius realize that during last night's escape, he had fallen into a deep pit. Fortunately, he had not been pierced by the steel spikes. Unfortunately, the escape had failed. The next morning, the priest saw the nuns moving around the convent. After 2 days without water, he shouted with all the emotion he had left. Margarita brought him water, only to shut his frantic mouth. But once a person receives a little kindness, they begin asking for more without end. He demanded that the nun untie him and return his phone. Margarita told him that because he had tried to escape, they had no choice but to bind his legs. This time, Father Ignatius finally quieted down. Clearly, he was not getting his phone back. Meanwhile, Father Ignatius's sister Frankie had not heard from her brother for days, and she felt deeply uneasy. Part of the reason the priest had accepted the assignment to inspect the remote convent was to temporarily escape his troubles in the city, as well as the tangled problems with his family. His sister tried calling him several times, but his phone was always off. She sent many messages too, but never received a reply. So she looked up the information and called the church, hoping to get news from the bishop. After all, her brother was the bishop's assistant, but the bishop seemed to know Father Ignatius's personality very well. And since it was a holiday period, the bishop believed he had probably turned off his phone on purpose and gone to the seaside alone for a vacation. Ignatius had done things like that before. Maybe he would be back at work on Monday. Even after hearing the bishop's explanation, his sister still could not feel at ease. If something had gone wrong, regret would come far too late. So the frantic sister rushed to the police station to file a report, giving her police officer friend Barnaby a few basic leads and hoping he could help investigate. The officer told her that no traffic accident had been reported for now. Besides, he knew the relationship between the siblings was strained, so it made sense that Ignatius might not be answering messages. He decided they should talk about it again after Monday.
You're a lazy prick. You know what kind of cop you are. A shit one.
After being mocked by Frankie and then laughed at by his colleagues behind him, the officer may have realized he really was being a bit dismissive, so he went to the local bar to ask around. The owner had indeed seen the priest a week earlier. The priest said he was heading to an isolated peninsula to inspect an abandoned convent. At the time, the owner had warned the priest that it would be best not to cross the tidal flats, but whether he actually went or not, the owner had no idea. After that, the officer drove to the seaside, The tide was rising. He lifted his binoculars and looked across the water, but the place seemed so mysterious and uncertain that he still could not draw a conclusion. Meanwhile, the three nuns began sorting through the items from the priest's car. Among them was an illustrated map book, but it seemed this forgotten convent was not recorded anywhere on the peninsula. It was as if it did not exist. At the same time, Sister Iphigenia found another booklet of designs. It was the project the priest had mentioned, the one meant to destroy this place and turn it into a retirement home. But the truth was not like that at all. Judging from the glamorous models on the plans and the swimming pool beside them, this place was clearly going to be turned into a luxury hotel. That was completely different from what the priest had described. But young Sister Carla was obsessed, constantly praising how beautiful the woman in the picture looked. Sister Iphigenia rejected the idea of turning the convent into a hotel, but the young nun was full of longing for it. She pieced the torn page back together, imagining that one day she too could stay in a luxury hotel and enjoy a refined life like the model. Just then, she suddenly heard the priest groaning, so she came to Father Ignatius's side, wanting to talk with this man. Carla was very thoughtful, even pulling the blanket over him, afraid he would get cold in the damp night. Then she lay flat against his shoulder and began telling him an interesting story, soothing him to sleep like a child. But as the distance between them grew closer, an emotion neither of them could resist began to stir. The innocent girl had no idea what was happening, and tried to help the priest calm the tension in his body. Within seconds, that tension was gone. At that moment, forbidden desire erupted. The priest's pure body was crossed in a way he could not bear, leaving only the sound of heartbroken sobbing. When the two older nuns returned to the room, they began analyzing what to do with the priest. Keeping a man by their side was truly against the rules, and Carla was at exactly the age of youthful energy. If they sent the priest back, they feared losing their home. So Sister Iphigenia came up with another idea: find a way to tame the priest. After all, what happened last night had pulled him away from God, so he might as well become the nuns' prisoner and live in this world far from society. The nuns wanted him to learn their way of life and become one of them. Of course, the priest refused, but if he would not take the easy way, he would have to take the hard way. The nuns lost patience and were about to leave, when the priest suddenly changed his mind. To escape this cruel torment for the moment, he agreed against his will. Since that was the case, he no longer had to remain penned up in the sheepfold, and finally returned to a more comfortable living space. But to prevent the priest from escaping again, the restraints on his legs could not be removed. At the same time, he had to learn knitting, because they could not just feed a grown man for nothing. Carla became his attentive teacher. In the end, the priest could even knit sweaters, smiling happily like a delighted woman. But this was only the priest's way of covering up his true plan. At night, when he was alone in the room, he would pick up the shell Carla had given him and secretly cut at the white cloth binding his legs, preparing for his next escape. Meanwhile, back at the church on the mainland, Father Ignatius had indeed failed to show up for work. Perhaps the thing they feared had really happened, so the bishop immediately contacted Officer Barnaby and launched a full investigation into the case. But based on what the officer knew about the island, a complete search would not be easy. The terrain there was complicated, and no one had set foot on the island in decades, so the best option was to send a helicopter to search. The bishop also thought that was a good idea. Before setting off, the officer deliberately brought Father Ignatius's sister along. If they could find Father Ignatius, perhaps it would help ease the cold relationship between brother and sister. On the other side, the priest seemed to be fitting in quickly on the surface, but he had plans hidden underneath. He used small tricks to please people, trying to build a better relationship with Carla, and the innocent girl did not think too much of it, even telling him about her own background. It turned out that 24 years ago, someone had abandoned her at the convent door. The two older nuns had taken her in, just as Ignatius asked who had abandoned her. Their sweet conversation was suddenly interrupted by the old nun, because in such a short time, they would not trust this man, but the young nun already did. One little flower was enough to steal the girl's heart. A roaring sound instantly broke the beautiful mood. In the distance, a helicopter was heading toward them. At the same time, the two nuns working in the convent also heard the noise. As if it were a bad omen, when the priest realized where the sound was coming from, he felt his chance at rebirth had finally arrived. But very quickly, the approaching nun dragged him to a hidden place, then hurried outside to find Carla. The priest seized the gap and freed himself from the restraints on his legs. As the aircraft drew closer and closer to the convent on the island, the priest escaped before the three women could return. Only a shell was left behind. It was the gift Carla had once given the priest, but now it had become a token of regret and bitter disappointment. That man had betrayed her. Just then, the aircraft was already circling overhead. The priest quickly seized the chance, climbed onto the wall, and shouted upward with all his strength. But the sound of the rotors was too loud, and his sister never realized there was someone on the ground. Meanwhile, to stop Father Ignatius from escaping, the two nuns immediately took action. Margarita used a curse-like ritual, hoping the people in the aircraft would leave quickly. The other nun lit a torch and entered a long-abandoned secret chamber. The pipe walls were covered with bats. Then the nun swung the torch hard, driving the swarm of bats outside in an instant. The helicopter was circling overhead and happened to collide with the bats. The bats swarming above forced the aircraft to leave quickly, but the priest's sister did not want to go, and was harshly scolded by the pilot. She did not want to die here for nothing. Meanwhile, the priest, desperate to survive, hurried upstairs and shouted for help with everything he had. Unfortunately, his sister and the others still did not spot him. His chance of rescue was successfully missed, but this time, the priest was in real trouble, because he had betrayed Sister Carla's kindness. Everything has a cause and a consequence, so he had better pray for God's forgiveness. A peaceful life is far more complicated than it looks. Sister Margarita believed that even if she had to give her life, she would protect the walls of the convent. But could they really get what they wanted? Now it was time to check on the priest. The man had unfortunately injured his leg in the fall, and his shoulder had also been dislocated. Now he was locked in a crude room, begging Sister Iphigenia to take him to a doctor. He was still fantasizing that his superior, the bishop, would forgive everything the three nuns had done. He could not move the nuns' determination to protect the convent. Meanwhile, Sister Iphigenia seemed to know a bit of medicine. Seeing the poor child suffering, she simply reset his bones herself. After feeling a little better, the priest once again began making arrogant accusations. He said the bishop would definitely come back, and that he would reveal the truth, along with all the horrifying things they had done to him. The look in Sister Iphigenia's eyes seemed murderous at first, but as she stared at the priest, it was suddenly filled with sorrowful tears, because deep down, she knew that if she wanted to preserve the home they depended on forever, imprisoning the priest and hiding the truth was not the right path. After thinking for a while, she returned to the place where the bats had been driven out. Hidden inside was an abandoned room, its objects already covered in spiderwebs. But there was one thing she had always kept. It was a newspaper from 20 years ago, carrying a missing person notice. The photo printed in the newspaper was of herself. It turned out that Sister Iphigenia was the heir to the Stanford family. She had once been abused and humiliated within that family, and after her sister helped her escape, she fled here, hiding in the convent and cutting herself off from the secular world. So why was she taking out this newspaper now? After several days, the high tide finally receded. Some children playing by the shore accidentally discovered a car in the shallows. After the officer made a brief inspection, he confirmed that the car belonged to Father Ignatius. The police suspected the priest had already drowned. The priest's sister questioned that conclusion, but searching for a person in the vast sea was never easy. Even the police stopped the search because of it, but his sister still refused to give up, as if some instinct told her that her brother was still alive. Only now, the police had already informed the church, and they were planning a funeral for Father Ignatius. Meanwhile, today it was the young nun's turn to care for the priest. Although Carla was the reason he had been pushed down the stairs and left bedridden, the priest did not blame her. After all, he had deceived her with lies first. Carla chose to forgive him. That night, the three women gathered together to discuss how to face the life ahead. They were afraid this convent would be discovered sooner or later, so in order to keep living here in peace, Sister Iphigenia told the two of them a story. Once, there was a noble young lady named Rose, the only heir of her family, who fell in love with a male servant from outside their circle. After their relationship was discovered, her stepmother sent a thug who killed the male servant outright. The girl named Rose was devastated, and from then on, she no longer believed in love. But what no one could have imagined was that to cover up the scandal and punish Rose, the stepmother ordered one of her men to violate her. It was a twist no one could have seen coming. This extreme setup, almost beyond reason, also laid the groundwork for what would happen next. And the woman named Rose was Sister Iphigenia herself. This was also the painful past she could never bear to look back on. Now, to protect the convent, Sister Iphigenia decided to stop hiding her identity and reclaim her inheritance, so she told Carla to find the priest's phone, then went straight to the priest's room. The priest thought the girl had finally grown a conscience, but the other two followed right behind her. They asked the priest to teach them how to use the phone. When the nuns pushed the priest's car into the sea, They had deliberately kept the items from inside it. And today those items finally came in handy. The phone was powered on again. The priest was overjoyed. He received many text messages and thought the bishop must be desperately looking for him, but they all turned out to be from his sister. The priest looked deeply frustrated. He had always had conflicts with his sister, and even when the two nuns asked who Frankie was, he lied and said he did not know her. After asking the priest how to use the phone, Iphigenia immediately took action.
Who's Frankie?
It's my sister.
She contacted the relevant people from the Stanford family, hoping to use the family inheritance to buy the rights to St. Agnes Convent. That way, everything would be legal and proper, and the place could no longer be destroyed by others. The next morning, the nuns prayed before the statue of Mary as usual, but just then, beautiful music suddenly rang out. It turned out to be the priest's phone. The three of them panicked and actually answered the call. On the other end was the bishop. The young nun accidentally let something slip. The bishop immediately realized that Father Ignatius might not have drowned after all. Just as he asked again, the old nun panicked and yanked out the battery. When the bishop realized the priest might still be alive, the assistant beside him wanted to contact the police immediately, but the bishop stopped him. He said this was a matter inside the church, and that he would handle it personally, and he looked very angry. What new mystery was hidden here? What secret was the bishop really hiding? Meanwhile, after hearing the lovely ringtone of the phone, Carla seemed to long for the outside world even more. She did not understand how a phone could allow two people so far apart to speak to each other. The priest patiently explained the mystery to her. Because of that, the relationship between the two gradually improved. The naive young nun even put on the precious dress she had kept hidden away. She said that if she ever went to the outside world one day, she would wear this dress. She also showed the priest that piece of fabric, and feelings of love began to rise inside her. But just then, Sister Margarita burst in. The old nun had always been unusually sensitive. She often saw visions of demons, viewing the priest as the embodiment of a beast, someone who needed to be purified and sacrificed. Madness flashed in her eyes. Just as the priest was begging for mercy, the old nun suddenly realized that the beastly shadow reflected on the wall was not the priest at all, but herself. She had become the greatest demon. An unprecedented fear instantly dragged her whole body down. This highly symbolic turn perhaps suggested that the old nun's faith had begun to resemble frenzy. Her inner conflict and self-judgment had become an uncontrollable beast, driving her into a breakdown so severe that she wounded herself. Carla called for Iphigenia, the leader, to come. When the priest opened the door for her, the sight before them was truly heartbreaking. The old nun's face was covered in blood, and the priest was badly frightened, repeating his apologies again and again. Perhaps this was the result of losing oneself inside religion. Blood and faith had collided in the most extreme sensory way. Later that day, with Iphigenia's help, Margarita's emotions clearly calmed down. That so-called beastly vision was merely the punishment and eternal curse for a sin inside the story. Meanwhile, everything the priest had suffered made the young nun feel pity for him. The priest truly wished someone would comfort his wounds. Struggle filled every corner of his heart. He felt guilty over the old nun's self-destructive collapse, tormented by the cold relationship with his sister, and abandoned by the bishop's indifference. These emotions inside him pressed down on the young man until he could barely breathe. But what he did not know was that the bishop was planning an even bigger conspiracy, because the bishop had gotten through to the priest's phone the day before, and Carla had happened to say Frankie's name, and Frankie was the priest's sister, so the bishop suspected that Father Ignatius had not drowned, but the bishop had already begun arranging the priest's funeral and had notified all the clergy to attend. If Ignatius was still alive now, it would seriously damage the church's reputation. The church could not afford another scandal, so he contacted a priest he trusted, asking him to find a way to get close to Ignatius's sister, gather information from her, and confirm whether the priest was really still alive. This priest, Bob, was harsh by nature and carried a hateful mission to cleanse heretics. Father Ignatius's sister was also a Catholic. Although her relationship with her brother was cold, Frankie still called on all her friends to attend her brother's funeral. But just then, the man named Bob interrupted her. By now, he had disguised himself as a devout believer, using that identity to get close to Frankie and prepare for the next step of his plan. Even when the woman went to pick up her children, Bob deliberately brought over the spark of friendship, trying to win her over through forced closeness. When he saw Frankie's two children, he had even prepared candy in advance. That alone showed just how calculating this man was. Unfortunately for him, Officer Barnaby, who had previously investigated the priest's disappearance, happened to pass by. In truth, he wanted to get closer to Frankie and felt a trace of love for this single mother, but when he saw a strange man step in, he felt somewhat disappointed. The officer had a natural sensitivity that came with his profession, as if he could sense something off about the other man. Still, at that moment, he felt more like a failure. At noon, while eating to vent his frustration, he unexpectedly spotted Bob through the restaurant window. What exactly was this man trying to do? With suspicion in his heart, Barnaby went to question the owner. Then he discovered that Bob had been asking about the priest's disappearance. That made the officer even more suspicious. When he saw Bob's license plate through the window, he immediately contacted a colleague to trace its registration. The result of the search took the officer by surprise. Bob was also a clergyman. What secret was hidden behind all of this? That night, the eager Bob came knocking at the door. He used the excuse that he had found one of the children's toys and specially returned it to Frankie's home. The man began making small talk, using the children's upbringing as an opening to bring the two of them closer. When he saw a photo of the woman from when she was young, he used a few compliments to elevate the mood. He had even brought alcohol with him, making the atmosphere feel warmer. Frankie also began talking about her younger years. She confessed to him that she had once been an addict and had caused a lot of trouble. Her relationship with her brother had broken apart from that time on. Meanwhile, while the woman was putting the children to bed, Bob quietly checked Frankie's phone, trying to find some clue. But although many messages had been sent, not a single one had received a reply. By then, the woman had coaxed the children to sleep, so she continued drinking and talking with Bob. But the man's hands clearly became restless, and he pushed into more intimate behavior, making the woman instantly uncomfortable. After all, they had only known each other for one day. After Frankie cursed him out and sent him away, another man knocked on the door.
Are you alright? Did the priest get you drunk?
Bob's a fucking priest.
It turned out to be Officer Barnaby. The officer was very considerate, placing a blanket over the drunken woman and checking on the little ones in their room. Things on the other side were also very warm. The priest's injuries were recovering quickly, and with the nuns' help, he even enjoyed a very comfortable bath. Carla, especially, cared for the priest with almost tender devotion. When the other nuns saw this, they no longer tried to stop the intimacy between them. After the hot bath was over, Carla went straight to the priest's room, because she knew he had a sister, and she sympathized with how much he missed his family. She went against the other two nuns and handed the phone to the priest first, letting him call his sister. But once again, the priest deceived the girl's kindness. He actually called the church office and left a message asking for help. When Carla asked what Frankie had said, the priest could only lie and say that his sister missed him. Looking into those innocent eyes, the priest had no words. Perhaps when a girl is in love, her heart is filled entirely with romantic longing. Only when the passion fades does she see the hard creases of reality hidden inside that love. The next morning, Sister Iphigenia put on a proper nun's habit. After a heartfelt farewell with her two sisters, she was about to head inland to face the family lawyer because she needed to inherit the family fortune and buy this ancient convent. This was also the first time in more than 20 years that she had left this isolated island. Meanwhile, back at the church, even after receiving the priest's distress message, the bishop was still holding the funeral with great ceremony. In truth, they would rather the priest really be dead, because Ignatius knew many secrets the church did not want exposed, so the bishop suggested that Bob go to the island and get rid of him.
The church is full, Malachi. People are here to pay their respects to your brother Ignatius.
Best not keep them waiting.
At the same time, as Father Ignatius's sister went on stage to deliver her remembrance, three character paths began to drive the whole situation forward. The minister headed to the island with the conviction of eliminating anyone who knew the truth. The priest, with the help of the two nuns, seemed to be gaining a new life, and Sister Iphigenia had also reached the mainland. When Bob arrived at the hidden convent and saw his colleague in the courtyard, his behavior seemed very strange. This also caused the old nun nearby to once again summon the vision of the beast. Bob was clearly meeting Margarita for the first time, yet he could call her by name. In truth, more than 20 years earlier, the two of them had belonged to the same parish, but the demonic vision terrified Margarita. She quickly called the young nun over, afraid that something terrible might happen because of this man. Carla even explained to her that this person was Father Ignatius's friend, and that she should not suspect the minister. But the truth was completely different from what she imagined. Bob stated that this abandoned convent had to be destroyed, and the three of them had to leave today. But the priest had already changed his earlier view, believing this pure place should be left to the nuns. Bob, however, believed the three women were dangerous heretics occupying church property, and therefore had to be removed. At the same time, the priest, unable to argue back, seemed to see even more dead nuns. Each of them had a firm look in her eyes, as if declaring that the convent must remain, and Bob, whose heart was filled with evil, could not see any of this. So after sensing God's will, the priest flatly rejected Bob's plan to destroy the convent, and also refused to make the nuns leave here with him. The minister appeared to agree on the surface, but in his heart he was already planning murder. After that, the two nuns brought the priest's belongings over. Leaving this island would inevitably bring some sadness, especially for innocent Carla. She had given her love to this man, yet now had no choice but to endure the pain of separation, because the priest's injured leg made it difficult for him to move. The old nun even gave him a hooked cane, but none of them expected that this would give the minister his chance later. Bob had come here under the bishop's orders to kill and silence him, because Father Ignatius was in charge of the convent's records, and he especially knew the truth about Sister Iphigenia's background. Back when Iphigenia fell in love with a boyfriend from outside her family circle, her stepmother sent her men to kill him, to cover up the family scandal. She then had another servant violate Iphigenia, and behind all these painful experiences, the bishop had been the true force pulling the strings. He had once been the Stanford family's most trusted priest, using that position to cover up the truth. After that, the injured priest was no match for the minister. At the critical moment, the young nun stepped forward, but the minister had already attacked, and the girl was being choked until she could barely breathe. Unexpectedly, Margarita struck the minister unconscious with one blow. Then, as she supported the injured priest and prepared to leave the scene, she did not forget to call on the flock to block the minister from continuing his attack. After that, the old nun hid the two of them inside a furnace, keeping them away from the minister's pursuit, but she herself walked out. Could there be some unforgettable grudge between the two of them? Meanwhile, Iphigenia was working hard to claim her inheritance. She had arranged to meet the family lawyer at a certain place, but she never expected flashing cameras to rush toward her, making it difficult for her to adjust. Even harder to imagine was that a wrinkled yet still refined woman would appear before her, and this old woman was her stepmother, the woman who had personally torn her love apart. So Iphigenia felt not the slightest gratitude toward her, only hatred from the bottom of her heart. The stepmother's appearance also signaled that it would not be easy for Iphigenia to take back what belonged to her. The other woman falsely claimed that the disappearance case all those years ago had dragged the family into hardship. What she meant was that they had already lost the noble status they once possessed, and the family lawyer had always stood on the stepmother's side, even altering the will in the past. Now he appeared to be hosting the meeting fairly, but in reality, he favored the stepmother's side. He knew Iphigenia currently had no children, so the altered will stated that her right to claim had expired, and only the next generation could inherit, and even then only part of the property and trust fund. The stepmother said she was willing to release the money Iphigenia needed to buy the convent, but her condition was simple. She wanted the Stanford family name. What that really meant was that she wanted to monopolize the family's property and the right to inherit its status. She did not want any branch of the family, especially Iphigenia. Acting as a descendant of the Stanford line, she wanted to completely erase Iphigenia's bloodline from public existence, to remove her from that surname and make sure the family's reputation and resources belonged only to herself. There is a hidden background here. Back then, Iphigenia's mother had been the family's lawful wife, and Iphigenia was the legitimate heir, but this stepmother conspired with the church system, drove Iphigenia's birth mother to her death, and worked with the lawyer to alter the will, taking the fortune and reputation for herself. Now that Iphigenia had returned to demand her inheritance and her identity under the family name, she was shaking the stepmother's status and the family's succession arrangements, so the stepmother demanded that Iphigenia publicly acknowledge her as a member of the Stanford family at the press conference, or she would not receive a single cent. For this, the stepmother even brought out the family jewels, trying to win Iphigenia's favor and make sure she attended the afternoon press conference on time. But after the old woman left, Iphigenia made a phone call. She asked what would happen if she could produce an heir of her own. The other person told her that as long as a paternity test could prove it, her heir would receive every privilege of the Stanford family, including money, land, titles, and her own estate. So did Iphigenia actually have a child of her own? The answer was yes. Before she came inland, Carla had specially made a doll for her. So Iphigenia chose to leave, and left a letter for her stepmother. She made it clear that she would not attend any press conference, and would never acknowledge her stepmother as part of the Stanford family. She also left the yarn doll for her stepmother, symbolizing that she had a daughter. This time, The old woman was completely stunned. After that, Iphigenia quickly arrived at the seaside. She wanted to return to the island immediately, because she had imagined that something had happened at the convent, but the tide was too strong now, and without a boat there was no way across. Just then, a man suddenly called out to her and offered to take her to the island. Who exactly was this man? Why had he appeared at just the right moment to help? The two said nothing on the small boat, but the necklace the man wore offered a hint. This man had once been an orphan taken in by the convent, and he had a past with the young Iphigenia, and that necklace was the proof. Back then, the convent did not allow relationships between men and women. After more than 20 years apart, they seemed to have forgotten each other's faces, and did not even say a word, as if they wanted to seal away that forbidden love forever. Meanwhile, the priest and Carla were not idle either, although the old nun had hidden them inside the furnace. That cramped space created the perfect conditions for the two of them. In that narrow place, they gave themselves to each other. But what they could not have imagined was that Margarita was fighting the minister for her life. While dodging his pursuit, the nun accidentally saw a girl in a white dress in the courtyard. This was the hallucination that often appeared whenever she was in extreme pain. At the same time, the evil Father Bob appeared. He tried to call Margarita out, planning to eliminate her with his own hands, but he could not see the crying girl beside him. Margarita felt endless pain, as if trapped inside a cage, unable to escape the restraints of the religious system. One broken cry made Bob immediately realize where the nun was hiding, so Margarita quickly ran deep into the woods, praying that her dead companions would help her break free from Bob's pursuit. But Bob knew nothing about this terrain and could only chase after the old nun by following her guiding song. Soon, the man entered a place filled with mist. Dead nuns appeared before his eyes from time to time, causing him to completely lose his sense of direction. In that hallucinatory environment, Father Bob stepped into the brambles. The place was packed with plants covered in backward thorns. Forget a person, even a small bird flying in would never get out. Together with the phantom spirits, the priest's mind completely collapsed. He forced his way through the pain, but accidentally fell into a deep pit. Everything instantly became quiet. When Margarita came over to check, the evil soul could no longer hide from the light. Father Bob had been pierced through by 3 steel spikes, and had gone forever to meet his God. At last, the old nun recovered her sanity, but when she called the hidden Carla out, the sounds of pleasure between a man and a woman came from inside. The old nun, who had only just calmed down, was instantly pulled back into the vision of the beast. She could not tolerate this act that violated her religious belief, as if it had triggered the tragedy she had suffered when she was young. Then, under enormous mental pressure, she opened the furnace door. As she prayed over her own sin, she poured fuel across the ground. Then the images from her youth appeared again. It turned out the old nun had a tragic past. When she was young, she had once been violated by a middle-aged man. She believed her body was dirty and that she was unworthy of being a faithful believer. Again and again, she confessed what she saw as her own sin. She believed that anyone loyal to the faith should have a pure body. She could never make peace with her past. So after finishing her devout prayer, she set fire to the dry leaves on the ground. At the same time, she also set fire to the bed of the sinful man, letting the flames burn his soul. This was why the beastly hallucination later so often drove the old nun into breakdown. In reality, it was the unforgettable mark left on her in youth by the man she had burned to death. She had never been able to free herself from that past. On the other side, after struggling with all her strength, Carla finally kicked open the iron door of the furnace. But when she came out into the courtyard, the old nun and the priest had already been swallowed by the flames. She tried to save them with the bucket of water nearby, but the fire was too strong, and there was no way she could do it alone. The pain in her heart tore through her hoarse voice. The vows once made, and her deep love for Father Ignatius, were all burned away in the fire. After that, Carla, heartbroken, went to the pool not far away. Despair gnawed at every nerve in her body. The warmth that once beat inside her had now dried up. She knelt by the pool, with only dead silence spreading through her heart. When Sister Iphigenia finally rushed back, she was shocked by the scene before her. Carla was lying motionless on the water. Iphigenia called Carla's name again and again, finally pulling her back from the hands of death. And Carla was Iphigenia's biological daughter. 20 years ago, inside the convent, Iphigenia had shared a secret forbidden love with an orphan who had been taken in there. In the end, she was forced to give birth to the child outside the convent, then leave the baby at the door. The baby was taken in by the nuns as an abandoned orphan. Now mother and daughter could finally recognize each other. And this too was a kind of redemption arranged by fate. Meanwhile, a miracle also appeared. They had thought Margarita and the priest would die in the judgment of the flames, but somehow, both of them miraculously survived. Only Ignatius seemed reborn, having lost the clothing that had covered his body. Margarita was still speaking of her own sins, as well as the sins the priest had committed. Yet somehow, even the injury on the priest's foot had healed in the fire. Perhaps the flames symbolized the purification of sin and the trial of faith, and also symbolized that they had completed their self-redemption and spiritual rebirth. Father Ignatius knelt before the old nun, believing she had created a miracle and saved his soul. He would go out and tell her story, spreading and praising her name. At this moment, Margarita finally let go of hatred and forgave Father Ignatius for what he had done. At the same time, she also accepted the divine value that forgiveness is greater than revenge. Meanwhile, Margarita once again saw the girl in the white dress. The girl gave a beautiful smile, allowing the old nun to finally make peace with the past. Because of this, she no longer saw the beastly vision. For now, everything was moving in a better direction. The priest also put on the robe the nuns had carefully prepared for him, officially joining the Sisters of St. Agnes as a devout believer, and spreading Margarita's miracle to the world. At the same time, he found Father Bob's phone. Inside were the messages between Bob and the bishop, so he planned to expose the bishop's hidden secrets and drag that old man down from his pedestal. Before leaving, perhaps because he could not bear to leave the young nun behind, and with Iphigenia's approval, the priest took this beloved girl with him as well. Meanwhile, the priest's sister was also finding love. Officer Barnaby thoughtfully brought over morning tea. As the two enjoyed their sweet moment, Frankie's phone suddenly rang. She had only held her brother's funeral yesterday, and today her brother was calling her. After breaking through his own barriers, the priest finally reconciled with his sister. 1 year later, because Father Ignatius had spread the miracle of Margarita, St. Agnes Convent became a holy site, attracting large numbers of tourists to visit and worship. Not only that, Carla and Father Ignatius also found their happy ending and welcomed a lovely daughter. They continued their journey of faith, measuring the road of their ideals with burning sincerity. Even if thorns covered the path, the direction in their hearts would never change. And with that, this series has now fully come to an end.